Hello, my name is David Allen. I'm Professor Emeritus in the School of Environment and Sustainability, and I'm a freshwater ecologist who's now been retired for approximately 4 years. I began my career at the University of Michigan, where I did a PhD in zoology, postdoc at the University of Chicago, and then I was at the University of Maryland for roughly 20 years pursuing my research in freshwater science. But I was very happy to join what was then the School of Natural Resources, now School of Environment and Sustainability, in 1990 because I was excited about the opportunity to bring my science experience and research interest to bear on societal problems affecting fresh water. I continue to do that in retirement and through writing and serving on advisory committees, and find it very exciting. Perhaps the most exciting year of my life was 1970, because in 1970, along with a number of wonderful people, I was helped to organize Earth Day 1 here at the University of Michigan. I sometimes liken it to that phrase, is there life after high school? Is there life after ENACT of 1970? Because every year, around this time of year, people find me again, and I'm famous for about 3 days as one of the original organizers of ENACT of Earth Day 1. And it's fun to reminisce about all of the wonderful experiences we had at that time. When I look back on ENACT and try to sort of piece together how it happened, it was a very spontaneous, very grassroots, very dispersed, very participatory set of events. It came at a time when so much else was going on. It came at a time when there were protests against the Vietnam War. It came at a time where the university was under very appropriate pressure to increase minority enrollment. It came at a time when women's rights were emerging, and the environment in some ways was just one more manifestation of the social activism of that time. But it brought another set of issues to the fore, which were in some ways different then than different now, in some ways the same. But it really provided an opportunity to rally a great deal of energy with support from community, support from industry, support in Congress for the need for more attention to the environment. And so teach-ins were happening. A teach-in on the environment was a very appropriate experience at that time. And I think it really sparked a great deal of change that has been progressive, that has continued to the present time. And very happy to see a 50-year anniversary, because the work is not done. So thinking back to 1969, 1970, when the first Earth Day was being born, there was a lot of energy coming from a lot of different places. Some of that energy was coming from Senator Gaylord Nelson and efforts to bring environmental activism out into a stronger posture nationally. Some of it came at the local level. I think a great deal of what got us started was one of my colleagues named Doug Scott. And of the several of us who were in the main roles with ENACT in 1970, Doug was the political activist. He was the guy who was connected to what was going on in national politics. And he brought back to the University of Michigan campus the urgency and the opportunity to have an environmental teach-in here in Ann Arbor. I remember a first meeting in one of the halls on campus. There were probably 200 people there. I attended. I was a graduate student at the time. I was in my 4th year of graduate study and should have been working on my thesis. But I thought this was exciting, important, and fun. And so I became involved. A lot of other people became involved. And in some ways, it's hard to describe exactly how it all came to be, because it was spontaneous, because it was dispersed. And that continued right through to the actual events, where we had just so many people working on different aspects of what we thought would make a wonderful teach-in. It grew into a 4-day event. It was quite large. The kickoff was in Chrysler Arena, 17,000 people. We brought in the Chicago cast of Hair and Gordon Lightfoot, very appropriate at that time. Although I remember protesters didn't like Gordon Lightfoot because he had songs about opening up the West, and he thought that there were people who felt that should never have opened up the West, should have just left it there. We had excellent speakers over the 4 days. We had Ralph Nader. We had Edmund Muskie, who at that time was a contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. We had a number of really leading lights. And those individuals, I think, made a powerful argument that the environment deserved consideration as a important public issue, and it drew attention to what were at the time very important concerns. A lot of it at the time would have focused on air and water pollution, the more industrial impacts. There was much concern at the time about whether population was the root cause of all environmental problems. There was some understanding that pollution fell on the disadvantaged, but nothing like what the environmental justice movement brings to the table today. And so there was some understanding of the potential for loss of massive number of species with development of habitats like rainforests and other habitats. So environmental destruction, environmental pollution, some of the people consequences, those were the issues that I think really drove the dialogue in 1970. And I think they haven't gone away, but I think we've matured considerably in our understanding of the problems that are facing us today. So it's easier to start with what's different than what's the same. I mean, what's different is the focus on climate change. That is huge today, viewed by many as an existential threat, certainly a problem that people can relate to in a way that, in my view, they couldn't really relate as much to the threat to species on the planet. As a biologist, the notion that something like a quarter to half of the species on the planet are likely to go extinct as a result of habitat destruction over this century is a cause of considerable alarm, and it certainly was a cause of alarm even in 1970. But it's remote from where a lot of people live. When you say that in the next 50 to 100 years, much of southern Florida will be underwater, many coastal cities will be underwater, it's going to cost a whole lot of money to deal with these environmental issues. It's going to affect the climate where you live. Then I think climate is an issue that is very far-reaching, and it's also very personal. And so I think climate really has taken center stage, and I think that's fine. But it's one of many problems. In some ways, the problems of loss of habitat, the problems associated with adequate water supplies, are as severe as ever. Climate actually is an exacerbator, an accelerator of those problems. And so now we're seeing much more in the way of interaction among issues, interactions among problems, and we're also seeing much more attention to the disparity between people who are most impacted by environmental ills and those who are not. And so we've seen the environmental justice movement, which largely emerged, and others will tell more about this, but largely emerged sometime around 1990. Climate change as an issue really emerged somewhere around 1990. These were not at the fore in 1970. In some ways, as a biologist, I regret that we don't see as much attention to the loss of habitat, to the loss of species, because it's ongoing. And so those issues are still there. Water pollution and air pollution remain issues in many areas. And so the problems that were of concern in the 1970s, having to do with basically human footprint and human waste and all the environmental ills that are associated with the number of people and the way they live. Those problems are actually there. The population's doubled since Earth Day 1970. I agree with those who feel it's inappropriate to blame all ills on overpopulation. But if you ask, has it gotten any easier in 2020 to solve the problems of 1970 with twice as many people, with a higher standard of living, and with much more of the waste generation that goes with it? Obviously, it's not gotten easier, and so these problems are every bit as severe as they were at that time.